So welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So this is episode 118, which is a really great group chat that we just had with Evan Frank, who's the co-founder of Fora. So Fora is reinventing the travel agency, starting by building tools to empower travel agents. So prior to Fora, Evan was the CEO of Onefinestay, which was notably acquired for over 200 million. So he has some really incredible experience with marketplaces and specifically in the travel and accommodation space. So this is a really great chat with Evan, where we got to learn more about his experience running Onefinestay, key learnings that he's now taken with him to Fora, did a deep dive into Fora as a travel marketplace, and also had a really great group Q&A. So I really enjoyed this conversation. Now you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So Evan, welcome to the group chat. You have some really incredible marketplace experience, specifically in the accommodations and travel space, previously with Onefinestay and now with Fora. So I'm really excited to dive into things here with you today. Before we do, though, I think it might be great if you can start off by sharing a little bit more on your background, though, for those that don't know you.
Sure. So, hi guys and gals. I'm Evan. Nice to meet you. I am, I guess, a three-time founder, CEO type person at this point. So my background started actually in corporate finance, right in the wake of the Web 1 bubble bursting at a small boutique kind of technology investment bank. I did that for a few years, then was offered the opportunity to move to London for a job in growth equity. So I spent some time on the buy side. I mean, the thing that I think bankers often feel is that the buy side seems to be having a much better time than they're having. So I was offered an opportunity to join a growth equity fund in London, which is how I know one of your community members, Andrew, who I see here, as part of that expat community in London. I was an investor for several years, turned 30, decided that I wasn't quite loving the life of being an investor either. And I think, like a lot of investors, you then look to the entrepreneur and you realize, no, they're the ones who are having all the fun. So through a couple of twists, ended up as a co-founder of a company called Onefinestay. And it was always the idea when the company could support it from a capital and a management span perspective. So I'm not from London, I'm from New York. I would move back home and launch Onefinestay in the US, which I did in 2012. So we launched New York in 2012, LA in 2013. I could talk more about Onefinestay to the extent those of you want to know more about that model if you're unfamiliar. Ended up staying through the acquisition by Accor Hotels, stepped into the CEO role as my co-founder, and the original CEO of the business moved on as part of that acquisition. I was then hired as a kind of hired gun CEO of a pretty unique business called Context Travel. So one of the things that I discovered from Onefinestay or one of the things I learned, I guess, is multi-channel distribution of travel products at scale, which is what we'll probably end up talking about a lot here. So did that for a few years, and that led me to move on from that experience. And the amount of dislocation in travel is what actually led to both myself and my co-founder, my original co-founder here at Fora, a woman by the name of Henley Vasquez, to both be in the position that we were able to do something new. And so we started Fora about a little over a year ago. And what we're trying to do at Fora is to empower anyone with travel passion and knowledge to participate in the industry as kind of a travel agent, but in a way that was really not going to ever happen for most people that are Fora advisors, right? They're not going to become traditional travel agents. Traditional travel agencies don't really have the right onboarding process or the right set of tools or brand to attract people kind of like us. And so what we're really trying to do is to empower essentially the entrepreneur next door, like startup founders, startup employees, CBD like manufacturers. I'm just trying to think of like some of our random advisors, sports reporters, venture capitalists, stay-at-home moms that are looking for a flexible, fun way back into the workforce, real estate brokers, and all of these people from different walks of life and different vocational pursuits to actually be part-time travel agents, but in a cool way that feels modern, tech-enabled, community-driven. And that's what we're trying to do at Fora. I would love to actually maybe not put the question to the audience just yet, but a question that I have is, what are we really? Because I talk about our business as almost like a business in a box, which is almost a category that's taken off a bit lately. Maybe we're a three-sided marketplace. I would want to like road test that with you guys because I don't really have the soundbite. But what we do essentially is we provide a set of tools and training and community to these new style travel agents to essentially sell and create their own book of business and sell travel to initially people that they know and eventually people that they know a little bit less well, but who they kind of network to as they build their own book. So there's three sides to this business. There's the travel advisor or the travel agent, who's essentially the seller. There's their client, who's the customer, not our customer, but their customer. And then, of course, all of this is funded by the travel providers themselves. So hotels and other types of travel providers, but mostly today, about 80% of the business is actually selling hotels. Exactly as you would go to Expedia and book a hotel on Expedia, you would not expect to pay more to do that. You could also book that same hotel through a Fora advisor or through any travel agent who you would want to work with. And that's all funded by the supplier in exactly the way that it's funded by the supplier with the OTAs. So that's kind of the Fora model in a nutshell. There's three co-founders. And this was really the result of a business plan that I had written coming out of the pandemic, looking for the next thing to do, but really from insights gleaned with some of the challenges with multi-channel distribution when you're a small travel business that we experienced at both Onefinestay and subsequently Context Travel. So I'll like stop there with the bio.
No, that's really great background. So thanks for sharing with us. And we just kind of jumped right into things. So definitely want to get into Fora, but I guess before we do though, to kind of take a step back to Onefinestay, could you just maybe walk us through kind of, your journey with Onefinestay and maybe some of the, I would say some of like that kind of key milestones or, steps along the way?
Sure. So Onefinestay was a really special business. We started the company, I want to say like less than a year after Airbnb was started. And the Airbnb of today really looked nothing like the Airbnb of 10 years ago, although I think the founding team there and Brian Chesky has done a tremendous job building that business. And it speaks to the point that I think we should probably spend a little bit of time talking about here, which is access to capital and how access to capital and paid marketing is really what built that business in the early days. And so now they're able to say, we only spend 20% of our revenue on marketing and it's brand marketing, but actually that's a pretty privileged position of having already arrived. Of course, they spent a lot of money acquiring demand for a long time. And so we at Onefinestay, we're trying to be a managed version of that. So a hotel management company for homes was always the initial vision of Onefinestay. So we would work with a homeowner who had an interesting property, a distinctive property, typically not just like a rental or something, but something that felt a little bit designed. And then we would manage everything from the photography and the onboarding of that property to the booking, the sort of the distribution, right? So the bookings for that property, to the cleaning and the service that a client would experience or a guest would experience when they came to town. So essentially, we were building a distributed hotel. Is the easiest way to think about, or hotel management company is the easiest way to think about Onefinestay. It was a managed marketplace, so we were curating the selection of homes. We started the company in London in 2010. I moved back to the US in 2012. We launched New York then, so we were still just New York and London in 2012. In 2013, we actually launched LA, which we operated in most of LA besides Santa Monica, which was incredibly difficult from the city of Santa Monica being super restrictive on short-term rentals. But for most of the city of LA, which is most of LA, we operated pretty easily, pretty cleanly. And we launched Paris right around that same time. So for most of the time of our journey at Onefinestay, which really ran from 2010 through 2016 when we were acquired by Accor. And then it kind of evolved in ways that we can talk about. We were really just operating in 4 cities. And that was because we thought the depth of the market and the depth of the opportunity, when you look at the TAM of like hotel demand, and then if you combine that with house demand in a place like LA or New York, I mean, it's billions. So we really were focused on scaling the business slowly and carefully and really delivering upon like a service promise. I could talk about like fundraising milestones and other things like that, but that's essentially the whistle stop tour through Onefinestay.
Yeah, no, that's really great. Thanks for walking us through it. So I did want to bring up the point you mentioned, managed marketplace, which are often fun with a lot of moving pieces, and typically I would say people and kind of ops intensive. So it sounds like Onefinestay was, and a lot could potentially kind of go wrong. So could you share maybe some of the challenges with it?
Yes, a lot did go wrong. So I think we certainly learned that. So I think for our business specifically, one of the hardest things to balance always was seasonality, and how you basically had this like baseline of staff. And like we could talk about HQ staff, but actually, even if you look at the city level had like a customer service team, and that customer service team is not a variable cost, it's a fixed cost. And we had a sort of an implementation team, a take-on team. And actually, when people are away in the summer, like not that many people wanted to list their homes on the platform or add their homes to the platform. So balancing what was the structural seasonality of the business with the cost structure of the business. And again, that's before we get to hard problems around sales and marketing to the client, was like this constant theme, and how much each specific city like node, and we ran each city on its own P&L, each city node could actually contribute to HQ costs, was just like the thing that we talked about constantly. So what is a fixed cost? What's a semi-variable or semi-fixed cost? And what's a true variable cost? And what we found, unfortunately, was not economies of scale. So the gross margin never really got better. It didn't always get worse, but that was something that it was really easy to put in an Excel file that like, hey, over time, our gross margins are going to improve because of this efficiency and that efficiency. But the reality is, when you're running an operationally intensive business, it's easier to suffer from diseconomies of scale than economies of scale. So you hire a customer service team, and then suddenly that customer service team needs a manager. And suddenly you're, basically staffing for more of a, like sort of a semi-peak than like the trough. So these were things that I think every marketplace founder should really be acutely aware of, which is what is your seasonality, and what's a fixed cost and what's a variable cost, and how do you really have a model that works throughout the cycle.
Yeah, that's really great. You did mention the team and like the org structure, right? As far as HQ and whatnot. So, what was the team like right before acquisition, and maybe kind of after, as you guys kind of scaled beyond that?
So yeah, so what we tried to do was have a matrix organization. That meant that the HQ functions, so central marketing or acquisition marketing, product and tech, which I think does make sense to centralize. I'm trying to think of other, but like data and finance, all of this was in a London HQ. And then we tried to strip out as much as we possibly could from the cities, and then have the cities run like operational P&Ls. So at the time, our HQ, and we had to do a layoff right after the acquisition, which is one of the reasons why I ended up probably sticking around for shorter than I might have liked to. I mean, I did the layoff, but it wasn't very much fun laying off a lot of my former team. But our HQ was pretty big. So we had like a tech team of probably 30 at that point, which is kind of outrageous when you think about a hotel management company in 4 different cities. But we had a tech team of 30. We had a very large acquisition, kind of growth marketing organization, brand marketing organization. We had a large finance and FP&A, as well as city, almost like accountant organization that was helping us close our books every month. And so it was roughly 100 in HQ. And then each city had team on the ground because we were managing cleaners. We were actually like provisioning homes and making them ready for guests and doing house calls and things when the internet would go out. So each city had a team of probably 20 to 30 as well, or 10 to 30 as well, depending on the size of the city.
Yeah, that's it's always great to learn about the org structure for marketplaces. On that note too, so you did mention.
I don't know if I would recommend that org structure, but that was our org structure at the time. We did have sort of severable P&Ls, which I would recommend, which is each GM of a specific city felt accountable for the performance of that city from a growth perspective. But that did also cause some tension with HQ and like marketing support and how much support am I getting to hit my growth targets. So that was a feature of that business.
Yes. So on that, to dig a little bit deeper on that, you mentioned you were in 4 markets. So how did you kind of select those markets? And then what was the, I would say like the market kind of like launch playbook like?
Yeah. So we selected markets based on depth of like hotel demand, which was actually, it wasn't that hard. It might've been much harder, when we were debating, Cleveland, Ohio versus Tampa or something. But when you look at the largest global hospitality markets in the world, you get to New York, London, and Paris really, really quickly. So the question wasn't what markets have the right attributes for the perfect launch. New York was basically the entire New York operation, depending on how you looked at it, was illegal by the city code, multiple dwelling law, just like it is in Santa Monica. But that's not really how we pursued it. We pursued it like entrepreneurs, I think, which is what are the biggest opportunities and what are the biggest addressable markets, and then how do we figure out how do we design sort of a legal infrastructure and a service proposition so that we can address those opportunities. So that was how the selection went. It was a top-down TAM based like model or sort of selection criteria, which I think actually did serve us quite well.
Yeah, it's probably going to lead to some questions when we get to the group Q&A on that. So I also feel like you and I could kind of get into the weeds with things with Onefinestay and all the details. But I did, when I get to Fora. So right before we do though, what were some of the biggest learnings maybe that you've taken with you from Onefinestay to then Fora?
Running operating businesses that is supported by venture dollars is really, really hard. So that would be like one. I think for a long time, up until maybe a year ago, there were companies like Sonder that were like kind of looked successful, but ultimately, when you strip all that stuff away, you're sort of running an operating company while trying to basically trade on software multiples. And I think that's really, really difficult. So I think you have to go in eyes wide open to the extent your capital mix and your strategy is really predicated on bringing in external VC dollars if you have an operationally intense business. So I think that's something that should be sort of examined pretty carefully. So that was one of the real lessons. And I think another real lesson is that know your distribution strategy and your sales and marketing strategy at scale. Because I think it's really easy to say, we're going to be able to reduce our cost of customer acquisition over time. And, we're relying on, Instagram I think a lot of the iOS changes and things have really changed this fundamentally. But for a long time, there really was no sales and marketing strategy that we were pursuing at Onefinestay or at Context Travel. It was basically like customer acquisition through all of the known channels, and then assuming that we can ultimately whittle that cost down over time, or that somehow the repeat rate or the LTV would justify the upfront expense. And that ended up not being true in either case. So Fora was really started because of this insight about the challenges of multi-channel distribution at scale. So I would say those are probably there's lots more lessons, but those are probably the twin lessons, which is operating businesses, but with kind of venture capital dollars on the cap table. And really understanding how your channels are going to evolve and scale, and not just assuming that you'll be able to figure it out as you get to more and more kind of like higher and higher reaches of market penetration.
Yeah, those are both definitely great, and we'll expand on them here in a little bit. So you did kind of mention that I would say like the founding kind of insight with Fora, right? But what was the what were like the first steps that you kind of took to start it as a marketplace?
So I wrote a really long business plan on like a Word doc. It was actually a Google Doc, but it was not a slide doc. So I just found, and I did this at Context as well. I just found that that exercise of actually going through like a true kind of traditional business plan, and like it's really easy not to write them. They're really hard to write. But I just wanted to get all my thoughts down on paper and make sure that staring at those thoughts, it actually made sense when it was all down on paper. I then shared that business plan with a couple of trusted people in my own network. One of which is our second largest investor. Actually, the other is our lead investor. Now that I'm thinking about it, although I wasn't expecting him to give me lots and lots of feedback on it. But I brought it to a small group of people that I knew would actually read it and just like ask me, sort of challenge me on it. Like, does this make sense? Like, is this a good idea? Like, what do you guys think? And that was kind of the first thing. And then I took that doc to my co-founder, Henley. So I think the other first thing that I did was find a co-founder, because I knew I didn't want to undergo a startup journey alone. In my opinion, it's a very difficult way to go. And I just didn't want to do that. I would rather have sort of worked for someone else's startup than pursued a solo entrepreneur journey, just at that stage of my life and that stage in my career. So those were kind of the initial pieces, which is who's like finding a co-founder and finding somebody who's willing to invest their time and their energy sort of fundamentally in the way that I was. There's no truer sign than kind of a good idea than that. And actually forcing myself to flesh out all the ideas in a narrative format to make sure that the whole thing ultimately hung together.
Yeah, that's a really great point as far as kind of working through that ideation stage and the kind of the doc. So maybe to expand on that a little bit more, is there kind of like one specific kind of I would say like insight that kind of stood out through that process that like led to like a big unlock kind of moving forward?
I don't think there was one unlock. I mean, I think the process of actually holding myself accountable for something that I was going to expose to the world as like a work of my creative, like my creative art, was the value in the process. It was bringing it to that level of formality and that level of accountability. And actually, I recently went back and skimmed this business plan, and it was remarkably true. So we haven't pivoted or anything at Fora. It was remarkably true to the initial vision that we laid out. Some things are, of course, different, but the mission is pretty much the same. The hypothesis is pretty much like, we are proving out the hypothesis on a milestone basis as we go. And so I would just really strongly recommend, because it's really easy to like go and start doing, but stopping and thinking, especially in this day and age, I think is often in short supply.
Certainly agree with that. So yeah, so jumping right into Fora, could you maybe just give us like an overview of where you're at today and what sense of scale you're at?
Sure. So the business plan was written in like March 2021 or so. And that's when Henley and I basically said that we'll do this if we can raise like at least $2 million of capital, because we also didn't want to do this from like a bootstrapped. Again, we're both in our 40s, we have families. Like that's not something that we were able to do. We needed to kind of get going quickly. So March, we wrote the plan and decided to work together on it. We incorporated the business in June. Our third co-founder, Jake, joined us in August. This is 2021. We launched the first version of the website in November 2021. So we're about a year old from that standpoint. And we launched the first sort of, service experience with 3 people that had never sold travel before, that we were giving our support to. It was mainly, at the time, it wasn't tools. We hadn't built any tools yet. So it was mainly like support and attention and seeing if we can activate kind of normal people who love travel to be successful advisors. So that was in like October, November, sort of over the summer, and then October, November that we started to really kind of experiment with them. So I think in October we had 3 active bookers. Last month we had about 250 active bookers. So that, like, in about a year, that's like the rough sort of scale of the network. October was not a small month, actually, because a few of those bookers were already doing sort of holiday bookings and things like that. And the economy was in a pretty good place, and people were, revenge travel and everything. So people were looking to get out there and travel. But, we've, like, I don't know, 50x the business since then over the past year. So, like, if we look at October or November versus October, November this year. And so we have about 250 active bookers, a little more than 250 active bookers. We have about 500 advisors that have taken at least a booking. So the activity, because it's designed to be flexible, it's not really like a job that you're committing a certain amount of time to, except in a loose sense. So there's a lot of people that take the summer off because that's the kind of flexibility that they're looking for. There's a lot of people that actually kind of do this around a wedding or a honeymoon for themselves or for a friend, and then they go away for a couple of months, and then they come back because they have day jobs. So we don't really look at how many people are like hitting quotas or something like that. It's much more, is the activity of the community kind of growing every month? So this idea of our version of like Facebook's MAU is like monthly active bookers. So last month we had 250 active bookers, about 500 advisors have taken a booking. 97% of these advisors have never sold travel professionally in any kind of capacity. They are the go-to person for travel tips. They are passionate and engaged around the idea of turning this into some sort of a casual vocation or a more serious career change, but they're not agents. And that's a very big difference with our business. And for example, the Compass model in real estate is we're not looking for existing pros, really. We're looking to activate and onboard all sorts of people that have all the soft qualities to be successful sellers of travel and successful entrepreneurs, but for whatever reason, largely structural in many cases from what the industry provides, haven't yet made that leap.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, how are you identifying, potential advisors or people that want to be advisors, and then, helping kind of onboard and educate them?
Yeah, so I think the referral and word of mouth has been helpful now that we've gotten a little bit bigger. But the campaign, which was still a campaign that we use today, is really trying to identify this go-to person for travel tips, which I don't think is the perfect phrase, but is the phrase that we use, which is most people know someone in their friend group, in their family, in their community that they will call if they're about to go on a trip. And they will say, hey, didn't you have that Google Doc of Paris? Like, I think you're in Paris and you had all those like restaurant recommendations. Like, can you share that with me? That person is not monetizing that. They're probably passionate enough about travel or about the experience of traveling that they could be activated in some sort of way. So we ran a social campaign on that basis, which is, are you the go-to person for travel tips? Welcome home, sign up for Fora, and earn income just like the pros, or whatever the initial marketing message was. So that's how we built the initial wait list. We also used a wait list. So we wanted to make sure that we were screening people on the way in so that our nascent and sort of immature operation wasn't overwhelmed by lots of people that just didn't know enough about doing this, that it would kind of reduce the experience for everybody else, or detract from the experience for everybody else. So we did start with the early selection of people that knew just enough to be dangerous. It wasn't really the fully casual, I've never thought about this before, but it sounds like a cool idea type user. We worked our way kind of up to that, and we onboarded all of these advisors by hand. So I think it's really tempting to think about scale. But the reality is we still only had 250 advisors last month, which is like, that's a very human-sized problem that we're booking something. So we tend to have human relationships with nearly everybody that joins. A little bit less so to this day because last month, for example, we just launched subscriptions for the sort of like seller P&L almost. And we're a little bit now further away from advisors in the onboarding, but nonetheless, we were keeping a pretty close personal relationship to this point. And you need a close personal relationship when you're entering into this industry because it is a steep learning curve. So you may have the raw desire, the notional desire to become a travel advisor or travel agent or sell travel in a new way. But actually, how do you book? How do you use our license number, our IATA number? How should you market this specific hotel or tell your friends about this hotel? Hey, I have a friend, but they don't want to go to anywhere that I know. They want to go to Portugal. Who should I turn to for something like that? Is it a local kind of partner that we work with? Is it just somebody else in the community that can support that inquiry? So, we are really quite close, and we now have a cohort-based training and onboarding program, which I think most of us will be familiar with, kind of cohort training programs or cohort courses. And that was always the vision. But for the first, 500 advisors, we kind of took them on by hand, hopped on the phone with them, and coached them through their initial sales.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. It's somewhat comforting, right? As we're all marketplace founders, kind of doing that ourselves here. So, so going to the demand side. So, how are you acquiring demand in, such a, I would say large market, but also one that's very competitive?
Yeah. So this is the thing that I wanted to make sure that I said to this audience, which is if we were also doing all this shit and acquiring demand, we would be like DOA. So in travel in particular, acquiring demand is a highly, highly competitive game. Which is why I go back to my initial point, which is know your sales and marketing strategy, know your distribution strategy, and make sure it's just going to get better over time. So we found at Onefinestay, we were and this happens in travel, and I think a few of you are travel or travel-ish founders. We were competing against the channel. We were basically trying to get distribution through Expedia and Booking.com. And I could talk about that all day long and why that was not a good solution to our problem. And then we were competing against them for the same keywords, right? And Booking.com in travel is one of the most sophisticated sort of Google marketers or paid search marketers in the world. And so we would have to be almost as good as them and their team of marketers and data scientists and algorithmic traders or whatever the hell that they have doing all their AdWord buying in order to actually have a shot at acquiring hotel in Rome or hotel in London type keyword demand. By the way, one anecdote about that. So I was at Skift Global Travel Forum last month, and Glenn Fogel was being interviewed, the CEO of Booking.com. And the Skift journalist, I don't know if any of you guys were at Skift, but the Skift journalist was Airbnb spends 20% of their revenue on marketing and you guys spend 50%. How does that make you feel was kind of the gist of the question. And Glenn Fogel was we had $7 billion of EBITDA last year. I feel fine. So this is the level of competition that you're dealing with when you're trying to compete with when you're trying to acquire travel demand. And so we didn't want to do that again. So our business and the sort of the clever part I think about this business is that we're really enabling the entrepreneur next door to sell to their existing book and to build a book themselves. So we are acquiring for sure on paid social advisors, agents. We're not acquiring the demand for those agents. Having to acquire both sides of a marketplace, if you want to think of this like a marketplace, is enormously capital consumptive. In this existing capital markets environment, I can't even imagine because it's hard enough to do one side of the marketplace in this kind of venture capital environment. So we're not acquiring demand. We're acquiring supply or advisors, and we're enabling them and empowering them to build their own books of business and to generate their own demand. Now, it just so happens in our business, travel, and this industry, there is a lot of power in SEO. So the other thing that we wanted to focus on from the very beginning was back to empowerment, but empowering advisors to create content to show rather than tell that they know what they're talking about. And so if you go to our website now, foratravel.com, you'll see over 500 guides or itineraries authored for free. Like, we didn't pay for it. It's UGC, so to speak. I mean, we did an SEO, like a light SEO edit, but we didn't write it. So that advisors can show rather than tell that they know a destination. And that's often a hook in. All the calls to action go back to them. But of course, that content, if it's good and if we do our job well, will also have SEO value. So it's not, sorry, advisor, we can't help at all. It's create some content. We do see every day a booking happening, probably every day, a booking happening from content that is created by an advisor on the site. There's more than enough anecdotes to show that that side of it works. So we are giving advisors tools to build their own business, and we have the know-how. They would never have the know-how necessarily to build their own SEO-enabled, travel website. But we could sort of centralize that for them.
That's really great. I'm glad I asked the question. I feel like we could probably almost have like an hour conversation, just on I would say like demand acquisition through supply. So cool. So we're gonna get into group questions here in a second, but right before we do, so I know that you guys recently announced your Series A, which is a huge congrats, by the way, and have some awesome investors on board. So could you maybe share a little bit more about what the fundraising journey has been like?
Yeah. So fundraising is, in my opinion, it's a milestone-based activity. And so we've fundraised around various milestones. So I guess the first thing I'd say is I do consider myself to be a real entrepreneur. But I'm not so much of an entrepreneur that I will sell my apartment and live in a hovel and put my family through years of stress and suffering to be an entrepreneur. So the reason I bring that up is because I didn't want to do this in a totally bootstrapped way. It just wasn't really practical at this phase of my life. I'm 43 years old. And I did not want to undergo a bootstrapped journey. So as a precondition, as our own milestone for actually putting down everything else that we could have done and working on this, I wanted to raise some seed capital. So we didn't really do very much before that. I mean, we had a business plan, we had a co-founding team. And again, it's much easier for investors to back teams rather than individuals when you're just starting out. And because of my track record, and because of, I guess, the insight and the unique attributes of the founding team. So Henley has been a travel agent for 10 years prior. She could speak to all the problems. That was enough for us to raise a seed round, or it could have been a pre-seed round. It wouldn't have, either way, but an institutional round, which is how I wanted to make sure that we raised that capital. And then we invited friends and family to come in alongside that. So we filled out the rest of what ended up being a $5 million seed, which is a pretty good seed. But again, we would have done it for as little as a $2 million pre-seed type investment. So that was how the seed round worked. And the milestones, we were very clear that we wanted to prove as part of that seed round for us were twofold. One was that there's notional demand to want to be a new style travel agent. And so we really validated that with a very quick wait list that we managed to grow. And, I don't know, over the course of 6 months, we probably had 20,000 waitlist subscribers or something like that. So, all around this message of do you want to basically, are you the go-to person for travel tips? Do you want to maybe, build a new career in travel? And then the secondary aspect, which is really more important, which is that we can take a subset of those individuals and we can turn them into successful selling advisors. However they define success. It wasn't $1 million bookers, and nor is it in the traditional industry either, but that we can convert somebody who's never having sold travel before into a active, successful selling advisor. And so those were the milestones as we laid it out. That's what we wanted to prove with that $5 million. And we had pretty sufficient early validation on that So much so that around February, March, and some of this is luck of timing, but around February, March, we went back to Forerunner, who's our lead investor, and we said, look, like, we feel like we've proven or we validated our Series A, or sort of our Series Seed milestones. What do you want to do here? I mean, it's always been a partnership, but we had some investors at that point asking to put a little bit more money in. It wasn't anything major. It was like would have looked like a like some sort of convertible structure into like the next institutional round. And actually, the benefit was not our lead investor, so our second largest investor from Hardcore said, "Hey, like we'd love to put in like a few more $1,000,000 because they got like sort of allocated down or cut down in the seed round. They wanted to put a few more million to work, and they offered to do that. And so that I guess created the environment for us to credibly say, look, we can raise a convertible note, and we would, maybe another 5 or something like that was the idea at the time. We just didn't want to run out of money in the next year because of A, some of the headwinds that I think we're all seeing, and B, it just felt like we wouldn't have validated enough by, I don't know, February, March 2023, now upcoming, for us to raise like a proper Series A. So we wanted a little bit more bridge capital to that. And then we were very fortunate that Forerunner also felt like we had validated our milestones, and they offered to lead our Series A as well. So that's how the fundraising here has happened. I want to spend personally as little time as possible fundraising, and being able to do that with insiders. In retrospect, because of what's happened with the startup economy, we probably got a good deal for the Series A. But at the time, it wasn't like it was such an amazing deal necessarily, but it would minimize the distraction because it was already sort of a group that we were working with in a very close relationship, so that we can get back to building. On the margin, I don't really give a shit about 10% dilution here and there. I give a lot of shit about being able to focus and building this business and not basically being a guy that's on the road constantly fundraising for this business just so I can, keep the company capitalized and, not have to do a riff or something.
I mean, I think we could all relate with that. You got a lot of head nods with that. So I also like how you mentioned the point about milestones. Might seem very simple, but yet very powerful in fundraising. So cool. So
and I also think it allows your investors to basically say, do I believe this team can do that or do they not? Whereas it's a little bit more nebulous, which is like, we're raising $5 million to build the next da-da-da-da-da. It's like, well, okay, but like, what does that really mean? And what do the multiples look like? And what is that, how much more capital is this going to take? Whereas like, do you believe that we can do these things? And that's a very, very different sort of specific, I think, sort of judgment that we're asking an investor to make than a very open-ended, ambitious statement around fundraising.
Yeah, certainly. Cool. So we're going to jump into group questions here. Hey, Hunter, do you want to come on?
Yep. Thanks, Mike. Evan, appreciate you jumping on today. Lots of awesome knowledge. Can't wait to dig into the recap where I can slow it down and consume it all. I wanted to ask you about, you were talking about focusing on supply and really having the SEO, UGC drive kind of that demand. Is that something you guys think about in longer terms that, focusing on the supply will be really where you guys focus? Or is there a kind of a tipping point that you think will occur where you're going to say, okay, we've kind of got that flywheel up and running and now we want to focus on demand? And do you have other ideas around that demand generation?
I really don't want to acquire demand in this business. I mean, maybe in the future, we will be looking at the data and say, right, it's time to do some paid campaigns or some real work on the, I can imagine there being brand building campaigns, because I think there's in this business, a lot of consumer education. Like, people don't understand that when you book through an advisor, especially for like, a 3-star plus 4-star or 5-star hotel, or like a safari or something like that, you pay the same, but you get better value. In other words, like a hotel level upgrade, like lots of like tips about what to do in the specific destination, restaurants, everything else. Often some sort of personal hospitality relationship with like a GM of a hotel or something like that. You're really treated like a VIP, and it's exactly the same amount of money because it's all basically funded by the supplier. So I think this is consumer education that I think most people don't appreciate. And so I could imagine us running some campaigns around this idea because I think it's generally misunderstood. And I think the OTAs have done a really good obfuscatory sort of job, making them seem like they're the cheapest channel to market when the reality, the cheapest way to book something. When the reality is, most of the time, it costs exactly the same, and you're put in like the back room next to the dumpster because the hotel has already lost money on you before you walk in the door. So consumer education, I think, is something that I could imagine us investing in. But I think if you really understand in our business the supply side, it's a fairly, we think, uncapped opportunity because essentially it's capture not from the existing travel agent kind of demand industry, but from the OTA and from supplier direct bookings that are happening in a not very thoughtful way. So I think it's like kind of a TAM question almost. And certainly we think there's enough just by moving some of the bookings that happen through strange and like not very thoughtful channels today through the advisor channel or through the Fora advisor channel, that we think there's enough to build $1 billion business doing that. Now, it could be that to build a $50 billion business or whatever, again, once we have Airbnb problems, we'll maybe have to reconsider that. But I think for the next several years, we're not really thinking about what the switch is to focus on the demand side. We do hope that SEO continues to deliver value and that over time, because SEO is a bit of a long game, that it actually can, as a proportion, deliver more value than it probably is today, which is today it's probably 90% owned book, 10% SEO. I would love for that to be, 50-50 or 60-40 or 70-30. I'm not sure if that's realistic, but we're certainly investing in SEO as if that's a possibility.
Great question. See, hey, Justin, do you want to jump on?
Definitely. And thanks for pulling me into this, Mike. It's been really cool because I'm, despite the fact I'm in sports, I'm actually seeing a lot of similar problems on my side. So thanks again, Evan, for sharing your experiences.
Sure. Thank you.
No, and it's been great kind of to hear everything you're going through. So one thing that we kind of offer, and this is, I mentioned actually funnily enough at the beginning of the call, is we're pivoting into mostly focusing on volleyball because we found what's working really well for us is just hosting like weekly volleyball games where we're kind of pairing a organizer and a court with players. Now, I kind of see some overlap for us with our game organizers versus for you with your, sorry, were they called advisors or travel agents?
Yeah, advisors. Yeah. Yeah, we use them interchangeably.
Okay, yeah. And I guess I'm wondering how you handle the process of, I guess, rating your advisors. Now, one thing that we're kind of struggling with is we don't want to put too many gates in to kind of scare away our game organizers, like having players rate them after the game and stuff like that. So I was wondering if you had any kind of internal checks that you use to make sure that the people on your platform are good quality and providing a good experience to your users.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we're not probably doing enough of it yet in terms of like the feedback loops. But we do qualify up front. So I'm not sure if you qualify up front, but there is a vetting process that happens before the onboarding even happens. So we don't allow people to like free sign up. We allow people to apply or fill out a survey, and we then build the wait list. And then depending on what is said in that survey, we determine the next steps from there. So that's how we've chosen to address the problem. I think user feedback or client feedback because ultimately it is our brand out there, although it's mostly the advisor's brand. So, it could be, and most people are building a book of business from people that they already know or friends of friends or referrals. So it is a word of mouth kind of referral business anyway. So we worry slightly about reputational sort of, contagion if one advisor, it just does a really bad job on a trip or something, but they're not really, the bookings aren't really Fora first and foremost. It's Evan, who's a Fora advisor and who's emailing you from a Fora.travel email address. So that is kind of what we're doing, I guess, from just like a quality control perspective, which is a bit upfront. And then yes, like if we catch wind of something that's totally blown, we can always choose to terminate the relationship. But they're not processing our demand. We're empowering them to create their own demand.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. That's a great question. So we have time for one more question, I think, and I'll wrap it up by bringing on a familiar face. So, hey, Andrew, do you want to come on?
Sure. Hey, Evan, and full disclosure for everyone on here, I'm actually an investor. I'm one of the friends and family that Evan talked about that he brought in at the end.
I didn't want to call you out. I didn't know if you would, disclose it at the end.
No, I'm a huge fan of the business. But actually, one thing I think would be helpful, because everyone here is marketplace focus. And I do think that it's interesting that, whether Fora actually is a marketplace or ends up being a marketplace over time is, who knows? But I guess the question I would have is, I've spent a lot of time, in marketplaces, and sometimes, something happens, something clicks where suddenly you see, the flywheel starting to move, and, it's not as hard to bring on demand, let's say, because the suppliers are bringing on the demand, and then that buyer is buying from a different supplier, let's say, and you see that business really starting to strengthen. And that's why that's why I love marketplaces. I know that's why Mike loves marketplaces. When they work, they really, really work. And then, 5 years from now, the thing is just autopilot, you kind of can't do anything to screw it up. There's obviously always things you can do to screw it up, but in general, it's hard to script a marketplace that's really working because you have that supply and demand liquidity. Do you think there's anything like that at Fora that you would see? Is it the example I just mentioned of like a booker booking from a different advisor because they're attached to the Fora brand? Do you try to build your own brand, or you mentioned that these customers are the customers of the advisor? I'm sort of wondering how you think about that. Like, what would the biggest success look like for you long term? Is it something like that where you see this becoming the liquidity where everybody knows this is where you go to book, a more high touch experience without paid marketing to bring them in, but they're coming in through an advisor and then sticking around for someone else? I'm just kind of curious if you thought about that and what you see as the holy grail.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard for me to conceptualize the consumer level differentiation that would say like, definitely, like if you want a cool advisor maybe, or like a new style advisor, I can imagine being that brand. I don't think we're going to win on the highest touch or like the most luxury, nor is that really what we're going for. And actually, if you're looking for that, you can often fall into the very traditional kind of camps of travel agencies. Like there's very high-end travel agencies out there. I do think for me, I don't know about this, like, I think the flywheel, and I should like write out the flywheel again. I had an early version of a flywheel, but I do think it's like how you create virality within the supplier community, the supply community, more than the supply demand loop. Right. So how is this so penetrated that it's like everybody basically has selling travel as a side hustle? That is actually the opportunity that I see. I don't see any real barrier to that happening. I think that one of the reasons why, like an MLM, like we don't really have MLM type features. We don't pay, like there's no like trunk or upfront fee or anything like that you have to pay. But I do think the reason why we give advisors Fora branded social templates, you can create your own social template, you can create your own travel brand, but most people are not going to do that. So the reason why we give, Instagram templates, the reason why we share their stories on Instagram is because they tag us. So we show up in their Instagram feed. So the virality, we want them to build their own business, but there's also this low level exposure of the brand that we hope it occurs to everybody eventually, even if we're not kind of perfect at consumer sort of supply side marketing, that like, why don't I do this? like the ROI is kind of there for me. Like if I spend $2,000 a year on even my own travel, which is what our join us page now says, like this just like makes sense. And it sounds like it'd be a lot of fun too. So I don't have like the perfect articulation of that, but I think to the extent there's this virality effect, which we are seeing a virality effect, I hope it's supply side virality. And I don't yet see exactly what the consumer level, demand level differentiation would be, that it's like, I'm just going to, Fora this trip or something, like we talk about that sometimes as an idea, but I'm not yet seeing that.
Great last topic to chat through. So thanks for coming on. So we're almost out of time here, and definitely want to be conscious of that. And Evan, thanks again for taking the time to join us and sharing all your awesome experience and insights with us. So I wanted to wrap up with one last question though, and that's if you could go right back to before I would say you entered the world of marketplaces, what would you tell yourself about them specifically?
Really understand your business model. I'm sorry, this is like slightly repetitive. Really understand your business model and really understand your customer acquisition or sort of sales and marketing and distribution strategy. That's not based on like Excel maths getting better over time necessarily. And don't really get going on it until you feel really convinced that you have a better version of that story. And that you can kind of credibly convince yourself that there's not going to be, like we don't need to like hope and pray and just assume things are going to get better, but there's actually a strategy that can get you to the level of outcome. And marketplaces, I don't know how many of you guys are bootstrapped or not, but like, typically it takes like a little while to get the whole thing going, which means that either VC dollars or whatever is like really helpful to just like get that initial team. But then like even more so, make sure you have a business plan that you believe and that isn't based on hope and prayer math, like over time. There's not that many marketplaces that have really like become generational multi-billion dollar companies. So just think really, really carefully about your specific version of your own flywheel.
Yeah, that's a great way to wrap things up. And last but not least, time for a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
Yes, I already gave my email address, but you can follow. So our website's foratravel.com. For anyone who might want to be a new style advisor, we'd love to have you, or tell someone else about it. That's join us. You can you can like, I am on LinkedIn. Not especially because I don't really mind. I'm not really have strong opinions about Twitter, but like I'm trying to be less on Twitter rather than more on Twitter, because I just find that every time I go on Twitter, I'm sucked into a dialogue of something that like I didn't really care or think about just before I got on there. So LinkedIn, Evan B. Frank, email evan@foratravel.com. Foratravel.com is the website. And I think that's it.